Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whichever applies to you when you're viewing this presentation on argumentation, also known as persuasive writing. This will be our next learning unit this semester, and in this learning unit, we will be writing an essay on a controversial issue. Note here, please, that there are a couple topics or issues that are off limit. I will not accept essays on abortion, gun control, or capital punishment. I will die if I read another essay on any of these issues. Please, before you get too far into this learning unit, make sure that you've taken a look at the assignment sheet and obviously that you've done your reading, perhaps looked at some sample essays on Blackboard, or certainly those that can be found in our text. This is an important essay for us because it may be the essay that you evolve into your documented research paper. The purpose of learning argumentation skills is in part to help you think critically about your own assumptions, to help you as a thinker begin to separate facts from opinions, to help you respect the right of others to disagree with you as you disagree with them. Let's talk about the basic features of the assignment. This assignment asks us to explore a very well-defined issue. It will ask you to state a very clear and defined position on the issue. It will ask you to craft a convincing, well-reasoned argument that is delivered to your readers in an appropriate tone. Let's talk first about a well-defined issue. Well, what is an issue? An issue, by definition, is a matter that is in dispute between two or more parties. It's a matter of debate. Often the issue can be controversial. The issues that we face on a day-to-day, though, may be serious or not so serious. But nevertheless, we face issues every day. The not so serious issues are issues such as where shall we eat dinner tonight? Or where should we go on vacation this summer? You might have in your family some issues such as this, where people feel differently about the issue. However, the issues that are larger are just as prevalent in our daily lives. You may wake up and find one day, for example, that the land adjacent to your property is going to be, or is slated to become, a land dump or a landfill. And this would certainly cause you great alarm. It could be an issue such as whether or not we decide to have kids or not. These are significant issues that a couple might face. So there are issues that are out there that face us daily. They are in our home, they are in our workplace, they are in our schools. And we always want to be careful how we present our issue to the reader, because ultimately the objective of any persuasive writing or any kind of argumentative debate is to be persuasive, to successfully change your reader's opinion on the issue. A clear position. Let's talk for a moment about this. This assignment requires you to take a firm and a very clear position on the issue. You are either going to state in your thesis that you are for, that is to say pro, or against, that would be the con side of the particular issue. This is not a fence riding exercise where you bounce back and forth saying that, well, some people believe this, other people believe this, now you decide. This is not what this assignment is about. This assignment is presenting the issue to the reader in a very clear and cogent fashion in the introduction, leading the reader to a very clearly stated thesis where you state your position on the issue. And then the body of your essay is really the advancement of your argument, where you present the case, you present the reasons why that the reader should feel the same as you do about the issue. We'll talk more about that in the slides ahead. But your position will be stated in your thesis. For example, the state of Alabama wants, deserves, and needs a state lottery. Now you can see by this statement that the issue is presented. That is the issue is of the state lottery. We have a very clear position on it. There's no missing the fact that the writer is going to be writing in support or on the pro side of this issue. So we need to always have a clear position. Don't make your reader ever guess where you are standing on the issue. Well, a well-reasoned argument sets out to persuade the reader to a particular point of view. And this would be your point of view. Argumentation, though, is not a hysterical, mean-spirited activity. Okay, this is not the kind of argument that you might, when we use this term argument, we're not talking about the kind of argument that you might have with a roommate or with your significant other or a friend or relative where there's name calling and the slamming of doors and hanging up on the phone. That's not what we're talking about when we use the term argumentation. It's not mean-spirited. It's not hysterical. What we're after here is very logical, very intelligent, well-reasoned discourse. A well-reasoned argument. Well, your book does a pretty good job, I think, of covering argumentation. But let's talk about basically two kinds of logic that's available to us as a writer. When we can put together an argument, we can organize an argument using logic. And logic usually comes in two broad forms, inductive and deductive. Inductive reasoning is reasoning that follows from the particular to the general. And I'll explain that in the next slide. Deductive reasoning, on the other hand, is the converse. It begins with very general and broad assumptions and then reasons to the very particular or the very specific conclusion. And the distinction will be clear in the next couple slides. Let's look first at inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning, as I just mentioned, is the process of reasoning from the particular to the general. For example, when you go to the doctor, you provide a list of symptoms. You may say to the doctor, or the doctor may ask you, what's going on? How are you feeling? And then at some point you begin to click off or list off for the doctor a series of very specific, very particular symptoms. Well, I have a headache, and I've been suffering nausea, and I've had the runs. Hasn't been pretty. I've had high fever spikes, and I've had those body chills and aches. Now, based on each of these specific, very particular observations, at some point, the doctor, because of his or her training, is going to reach a conclusion that is based on those particular reasons or those particular symptoms that you have provided. He doesn't draw the line, but I'm doing this to show you that at some point we jump over this little line. This is called the inductive leap, if you will, and we draw a conclusion. And it may be that the doctor says, you are one sick puppy. I bet you have the flu. The conclusion that the doctor reaches is a generalization based on the particular observations. In the case of this example, those particular observations are symptoms. Okay? But what we will ultimately get to is looking at our issue in the same way, wherein we can present the reader with particular reasons why we believe that our position, our side of the issue, is the correct one. And at some point, we hope that through the process of presenting these particular reasons to the reader, that the reader will agree with us, with our conclusion, that our position on the controversial issue is the logical one to hold. I hope that makes sense. Note, the conclusion that is reached may or may not be accurate. The preponderance of observations, however, may make the conclusion more likely to be valid. In other words, what I'm saying here is that if you came into the doctor and you said, and you could only provide one symptom, or maybe just two very vague symptoms, the conclusion that could be reached here, the fact that you have the flu, may or may not be the right diagnosis. So the more symptoms that you could click off for the doctor, the more likely that the conclusion that he reaches will be the right one. So when you're crafting your argument, the more reasons that you can present to your reader about the issue, the more facts, the more judgments that you can present to the reader, the more likely he or she is to reach the conclusion that you are leading the reader to reach, and that is that your position is the correct one. Okay, let's talk very briefly about deductive reasoning. This would be the opposite, sort of, than inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is the process of reasoning that flows from the general to the particular. It usually consists of a syllogism. There's a 25-cent word for you if you're ever on Jeopardy. A syllogism is a three-part argument that consists of a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. Here's a classic example. Major premise. Okay, I'm back. I had to step away for a second, and I've kind of forgotten where I am, but I think we were talking about the deductive reasoning model of a syllogism, which consists of the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion. And this is, again, a very classic, very simple illustration of deductive reasoning. If we have, for example, as a major premise that all the apples in this barrel are ripe, and then we continue by holding up an apple, and we assert that this apple is from the barrel, then the conclusion that we are forced to reach is that the apple is ripe. So we have a major premise, all the apples. That's very general, isn't it? And then we go to the minor premise, this apple. And we're getting a little more focused, a little more particular. And then we reach the conclusion that this apple is ripe. The conclusion must follow logically, doesn't it? However, the conclusions are only accurate, really, if the major and minor premises are true statements. For example, if I gave you as a major premise, all women love to cook, and then the minor premise, Jennifer is a woman, the conclusion that we would have to reach is that Jennifer loves to cook. Now, this may or may not be true. One major flaw in the argument is the major premise. The major premise that all women love to cook is a flawed statement. It's not true. And so therefore, everything that comes after it that is built on that statement is suspicious or may or may not be accurate. A well-reasoned argument, and this is central. This is so important, so please pay attention to this. A well-reasoned argument must address and acknowledge the opposition. Failure to do so is being unreasonable, and we don't ever want to be perceived as being unreasonable in our arguments. The issues that we are writing about more often than not, are complex issues. That's why they're issues. And to present only one side of a very complex issue is to be unreasonable. It is to be childish. It is to be unsophisticated. Always assume that your readers are intelligent and skeptical, because they probably are. When they recognize that you have not considered the other side of the issue, they have every right to ignore you, and you have a hard time successfully persuading people who ignore you. Think about that for a minute. You cannot simply present one side of an issue to a reader who is perhaps skeptical or undecided, because an undecided person will know at some level that there are other people who feel differently about this issue, and that if you are presenting an argument that is one-sided only, the reader can just completely dismiss you and say, well, this writer has failed to acknowledge the opposition, has failed to address the concerns and the position of those people who feel differently. When you address and you acknowledge the opposition, really what you are doing rhetorically is demonstrating to your readers that you have a command of the issue, that you are aware of the complexity of it, that you have examined it, and that therefore your argument will appear more valid and legitimate. Do you see how that makes sense? If you can address the opposition right up front, acknowledge them, summarize their arguments, identify who they are and why they believe what they believe, you as a writer appear to be in much more control and have much more credibility with an audience or a reader, again, who may be sitting on the fence and yet undecided with the issue. An appropriate tone. An appropriate tone means you do not ridicule, criticize, demean, mock in any kind of mean-spirited fashion your reader or the opposition. So this is not a place to be sarcastic. It's not a venue for maybe ill-conceived humor. Remember, you need to have a tone that is authoritative, that is logical, that is rational, that is ultimately persuasive, because your credibility is on the line with your reader. When your tone gets too caustic or too sarcastic or mean-spirited, readers will ignore you because you're a nut, right? I mean, we've all been around people whose arguments might disintegrate into name-calling or mocking or ridiculing. And the effect of that, the net effect of that, is that we ultimately tune that person out and we ignore them. Pitfalls. For this assignment, I do not want you to use any secondary sources. In other words, I don't want you to begin introducing into this paper statistics or expert testimony or data or surveys or any kind of research that you may have done on the issue. That time will come, and it's coming in the next learning unit, perhaps. But we will reserve the research for the documented research paper. So I want this paper to be all you and no secondary sources. Another pitfall is to base your argument or portions of it on bad logic. The fancy word or fancy term for bad logic is logical fallacies. And your book does a nice job of, I believe, of presenting the logical fallacies that are often committed. And so it would do you well to familiarize yourself with those fallacies, so not only that you can avoid them in your own writing, but even more importantly, if you're familiar with logical fallacies, in particular ones, if you're familiar with the bad logic that often goes with argumentation, you can identify those fallacies in your opposition's argument. And that will come in really, really handy. Obviously, forgetting to address the opposition. You need to have in this essay a paragraph. I mean, that's the way I would probably do it. A paragraph in my essay where I would acknowledge that there are people who feel differently, on this issue than I would summarize who they are. I would address, define who they are. I would also acknowledge or try to summarize to the best of my ability why they believe the way they do on the issue. And then I would certainly look for any kind of uh, uh, logical fallacies in their way of thinking, because that will expose the weakness in the opposition, which is ultimately what you'd like to do if you're trying to persuade somebody. Another pitfall in this assignment is if you do not take a clear stance. Remember, you need to have a very clearly stated thesis in your introduction that states very clearly your position on the issue. Remember, look, if you have any questions at all about this assignment, please do not hesitate to email me or post a message on the message board or send me a message in Blackboard. Be glad to help you. This is an important assignment. It's one that I think will serve you well in your academic writing again, and certainly in your career as a citizen out there, because we are, as I said before, you will be faced with issues throughout your life. And again, some of them are not so significant, but let me tell you, there are some that hit us in life that are really, really huge. And being able to examine that issue and being able to formulate a position, formulate an argument or a case for your position on the issue will serve you very, very well. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to call, email or post a message. Be glad to help you in any way I can. Until next time, I'll see you online. Be kind to each other.